Rob at No Limit Engineering, and today in the next 20-30 minutes we're going to show you a walkthrough of the correct installation of one of our Fatbar rear suspensions and one of our wide ride front suspensions. We have a nice prepped 59 Chevy long bed chassis, which may be a little different than what some of you guys are working on, but we're going to show you the correct way to install these suspensions and how to calculate all your measurements and set all the angles. Alright, now the most important thing in a project like this is to make sure that your chassis is nice and level. If it's crooked when you weld it, it'll be crooked when you drive it. So get it up on 4 jack stands, and we're going to make sure it's level side to side and front to back. Once it's up, if it's not sitting dead level, we just use some shim stock, different thicknesses of some scrap metal placed in between our jack stands or crossbar and the chassis itself, and you work it until it sits dead level. Now the next thing we need to do is accurately plot out our axle center line. Wherever we mark this now is where it's going to be. Now we give you with our kits all the measurements of where it should be on a factory chassis. So starting from the rear of the frame, we just measure forward to mark our center line. And with our rear suspension kit, as per the instructions, we're going to put another mark 36 inches forward of the center line. Well, once you have a mark on the chassis, if your frame's sitting dead level, it's very easy then to draw a nice straight line up and down. Just rest your level on the ground, get the bubble to be dead center with it lined up, and then scribe a line on as I have done here. Alright, now before we start with any of the suspension installation, I'm going to stiffen this chassis up a bit. Now we got some of our pre-cut boxing plates, and this customer doesn't want this chassis or truck to be super low. We're going to do some towing with it, so we're not going to C-notch it and we're not going to step notch it. Since it's staying in a stock configuration, we're going to make sure we can use the factory bump stops. So if you notice, I have tack welded in a couple of 5/16 nuts we can use to bolt the factory bump stop on later. And I'm going to fit my boxing plates and weld them in place. Now these chassis started out with a motor that made about 80 horsepower. We're going to replace it with a motor that makes about 400 or more. And these chassis can sometimes flex because of that. So stiffening them up now is a good idea. Alright, well, through the magic of television, we got her all boxed up. And you guys may notice that while we were working on this section of the chassis, we removed the factory rear cross member, and we've replaced it with a new cross member, a piece of 2x3 120 wall tubing. We moved it back to create enough room for one of our custom fuel tanks back here. And with all the frame prep done, we're now ready to start the installation of the suspension. Now with all the chassis prep done, we're ready to start with some suspension parts. This is most of the pieces of a basic Fatbar kit. And you can get these to be set up with coilover shocks or shock waves or a bag and shock air ride setup. And when you order them, they can complete with everything that you need. These are pre-welded housing mounts for the 4 bars to the axle housing. These are the chassis mounts that mount the bars to the chassis. This is the pan-hard rod mount for the rear axle, and this is the pan-hard rod mount for the frame. You have the pan-hard rod mount, or the pan-hard rod itself here, all of the hardware, and the 4 bars. Now, we build ours a little different than everybody else. These are a larger diameter tube, they're 1.25 inches. They have a hex milled insert on the end, poly-bushed ends, and these come out to be 30.25 inches long. Now you have to assemble these, and we want you to get them all the same length, and there's an easy trick for that. Once you've set your first bar at 30.25, take 2 of the long bolts from the hardware kit, slide them through, and once the other bars are adjusted correctly, you can test them. They should slide right on top like that and slide easily off. Now once all your bars are set to length, we're ready to start with the install, and we're going to start by mounting the chassis mounts onto the frame. Alright, now you remember we first marked the axle center line, and then we put another mark 36 inches forward of the axle center line. Now this is going to be the leading edge of our 4-bar bracket. It's going to fit up just like so. But before I put this on, I can't weld through the paint, so I need to sand some of that off. Now with it clean and prepped enough to weld, I want to make sure the backside of my mount is clean. I'm going to fit the mount up to the chassis, lining the front edge up, and clamp it into place. Now with the bracket clamped into place, double check all our measurements, make sure it's nice and square and level, and we'll tack it to the frame. Alright, now with the frame mounts tacked in place, we're going to start to assemble some of the suspension. Just grab your link bars and some of the hardware and start bolting it together. repeat this on the other side. All right, now we got a rear axle set in here. This is a new Curry 9-inch. It's 60 inches wide. It's a drum brake rear, and we got a new third member in it with 411s. Now we have a real nice fixture that we put the rear axles in when we weld brackets on them normally, but we know you guys don't have that. So we're going to show you a way to do it at home and get a real good result. We set it up on some jack stands to approximate our ride height. Now I told you before we don't want this truck real low, so we have 4 inches between the top of the axle housing and the bottom of the frame. Now to get this to set dead level, we did the same as our chassis, and we put shims between the jack stand and the housing side to side to make our axle dead level. One trick you can use is, you notice we have this motorcycle tie-down strap here. We got it hooked around the rear axle and we're pulling it up to the frame. And this is going to keep the axle pulled into the housing brackets for the 4 bars. And this is a way that you can do this at home and get a good result. Alright, now one thing you need to pay attention to is setting the pinion angle. And the pinion should be parallel to the output of the transmission or the crankshaft. Now we don't have our motor and trans in place yet, so we're going to estimate. And we think our motor and trans will be leaning back at 3 degrees. So we want our pinion to be pointing up 3 degrees. But there is a little bit of flex in a 4-bar system, so whatever it is to be parallel, we then want to push the pinion down 1 degree. So we're looking for about 2 degrees up, and that we check with this little dial indicator, and you can get these at local hardware stores. And we now just have it supported by a piece of bar stock that we cut and a couple shims to get it right on the money. Now we also need to make sure that our rear axle is dead even side to side and that our 4-bar brackets are centered up. So we can measure between the frame and the backing plate here, make sure that's the same on both sides. In this case it's 8 3/4. You can also measure from the housing end into the 4-bar bracket, which is 5 3/4 on this setup. Now we want the outside of this 4-bar bracket measured across the outside of the other bracket to be the same as the width in the front, which is 41 3/8. So you keep measuring and checking until all of these measurements and then across all line up. So with all your measurements checked and double checked and you know exactly where everything's in the right place, we're just going to put a couple tacks on the brackets. Now, we mentioned before that these Fatbar 4-bar kits can be used with either a coilover shock, a shockwave, or an airbag and shock assembly. Now, this truck's getting a bag and shock, but I want to show you guys how you would do it if it was a coilover or shockwave. This is our lower bracket. It's 3-position mounting. It's nice and thick. It's got a big, thick one-piece block in the back, and it fits on the axle housing just outside the 4-bar mount. So if you were doing a coilover setup, you would line this up just outside the 4-bar mount, set this dead level up and down, and tack it in place. Later when you weld it, this can be welded to part of the 4-bar bracket to help strengthen and stabilize it. Now the upper mounts are formed, and they're a left and right assembly. They're just trying to match the taper of the frame, and they fit just on the outside of the frame like this, and we give you a dimension that tells you how far back from the center line to mount it. And this is how you would do it if you're using a coilover or a shockwave. Now, as we said on this truck, we're doing a bag and shock assembly, and we supply you with everything you need. This is our housing mount for the airbag, and it's cut to fit around the axle tube. It's got a hole to mount the lower part of the bag. And you notice these 2 notches that we cut in it. These are set up to mount right around our 4-bar bracket. So it makes it a real easy install. You just drop it on the housing like so. And we want this to sit nice and level. So we'll put an indicator on here. Bring it up to being nice and zeroed out. And we'll tack that into place. Now with our lower bag mount in place, the next piece to fit on is the upper bag mount. And setting the gap between these is pretty important. Now we'll give you all the specs depending on the airbags you're going to use and the ride height you want of what that installed height of the airbag should be. Now these brackets that we give you, they're formed left and right, and they allow you to position the inlet port of the airbag in whatever position, inboard or outboard, that you choose. Now an easy way to do this, so I just take a piece of all thread and I set the top of it flush, and I run a nut up the bottom that gives me my installed height of the airbag. I'm going to drop it through my lower mount here and run a nut up to snug it into place. This will help me set the height of my upper bag mount. What I need to do is to make sure that it's really in the right place. So from back edge to back edge should be level, straight up and down. I already put a little mark here to help me out with this install. And it should be level coming out